Good evening, everybody. It's June 18th, 2021, probably 10:30, 10 o'clock, 10:30, somewhere around there. I live such an exciting life that now I'm at home making videos on a Friday night while my kids are out having fun, which is kind of cool to think about. But no, people have asked, when are you going to do another video? When are you going to do it? So I know it's been a while. I had a lot of stuff going on and wanted to throw one out here because I think this is an interesting conversation too. Um, and it was kind of spurred not because of my dad, but as I've had the same conversations with other people. But um, talking to him recently, we can all complain about, and we all are complaining about government and what's happening in our local municipalities all the way up to the federal level. And it's just kind of like giving me more ammunition to say, see, I mean, why not give volunteerism slash anarchy a try? And, you know, when I push on those arguments on people, uh, a, one of a series or one of a few retorts are always made, and such was the case with my dad in this conversation, was, well, what do you want to live like it was in the Wild West then? Hence the picture. And so, yeah, I mean, the Wild West. Let's talk about that for a second because what exactly do you believe the Wild West was in the first place? Um, I have mentioned this in the last video, and I've kind of make mention to this in other conversations I have with people, but I think context is everything. Maybe not everything, but it's certainly a lot when it's having these discussions. Definitions of terms are also a huge factor in conversation and recognition of what exactly is reality. And again, we need to talk about truths and truisms and what exactly did occur or did not occur. So when people say, well, what do you want it to be like the Wild West then? Well, what exactly do you mean by the Wild West? I don't know. I can't answer that because I don't know how you define that. Are you defining that because of the movies that you've watched and the romanticized versions of things that may or may not have even happened during when the West was being tamed? What exactly do you mean by the Wild West? Because the thing of it is that well, there's a few things. First thing is there were writers um, on the East that were writing stories about the West in order to entertain the people in the East. Because the people in the East, they had to know about these fantastical stories and events that were happening out there, over there in the West. And I think that it'd be imperative that we understand certain things and when we're talking about these things. So context, definition. Also remember that technologically, um, in our present day, we may be more advanced than what was happening in the Wild West, but psychologically, I would argue that we're not. We have definitely stunted our growth since the Renaissance era. There have been great advancements in certain aspects for sure, but those are neither being used organically nor are they allowed to blossom organically with the majority of the people. They're used by, again, governments and wealthy private interests. Um, that technology is being used by them in order to suppress or control the majority of the rest of the people on this planet. We certainly don't have access to it, and it's certainly not being grown organically by us. And so that's one aspect. So psychologically, again, I don't think that we've grown much, and for whatever reason, we still need to be entertained. We still need this constant, and it's worse. It's actually, I think, who knows? I wasn't living back then in 1850, but man, it seems like we all need to be entertained so much of the time. And so we had these writers writing fantastical, romanticized versions of the West. Um, Also, along that line, I mean, obviously you have the Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid and the Dalton Gang, and and Bat Masterson and Billy the Kid and Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday and some of the famous ones and uh, Wild Bill Hickok, which is another interesting story because he was a scout in the Union Army, and he was, I don't know if he wrote plays, but he was an actor, a scout. He was a thief, a murderer, and a robber. He was also a lawman. And so, along the lines of these fictitious stories, one of the first shootouts that he had, and I don't remember the exact um, name of the people, Mick something, I think, was the other people that he shot. But supposedly, if you hear these stories, especially that was going around during the time, well, Wild Bill and his gang were, you know, they came upon this group and there was this huge gun battle and he took 5 shots and dang near bled out, but he was such a man that he lived and to tell this tale and blah blah blah. The real story that was given by a 12-year-old that happened to be the only witness that was there and still alive, supposedly, and it was given at this sham of a court hearing that happened outside of the um, place where it had occurred, supposedly to this kid, the Kellens or something, whatever. But they weren't even armed. They were basically ambushed, and they basically just shot him. And so this is what I'm saying. You're if you're envisioning the Wild West to be something that was derived from stories that you were told or movies that you had watched or even stories that were supposedly written by people at that time who weren't even there, are you getting the full truth? Are you understanding what the Wild West was? Also, more acts of violence were being committed per capita in the tame East versus what was happening in the Wild West. And I would argue, and it would be hard to quantify, but in sociology class, I remember, because we obviously did papers and speeches and whatnot, but I remember the statistic back then because I'd done it on a topic of violence and aggression and whatnot. But um, the statistic back then was there was one act of violence committed every 20 minutes in New York alone. This is 20 years ago, of course, when I was in sociology, so that number may have changed higher, lower, I don't know. I can't imagine it being much different. But, like, I pay my taxes. Most people I know pay their taxes. And so Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who is an elitist and a piece of garbage, had said that taxes are the price you pay to live in a civilized society. Well, I've paid mine. Most of you have paid yours. My question is, when does the government's role in this whole thing kick in? When do they have to live up to their side of the bargain? Because our society isn't civilized. It wasn't back then, and it certainly isn't now. Again, I would argue that more acts of violence are being committed per capita now today than there were back then. Another thing to keep in mind, contextually speaking, is you had, depending upon when you define it, I guess historians might differ a little bit on this, but roughly in the 1780s, around plus or minus 10 years, was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And that, of course, lasted about 80 to 100 years. So through that time, through 1760, 1780, through 1860 to 1880, the Industrial Revolution was going on. And money, everybody needed money. Just like today, it's all about money. This whole thing's about money. So a lot of the West towns were staking claims and, go big or go home type of thing. And it was wild. It was a wild time to be because everything was about money. It's not much different today. We're fighting wars and shit's going down on the streets now. So again, living like the Wild West, kind of are already. Third thing, speaking of the Industrial Revolution, around that time, and I mentioned this in my other video, kind of one of the reasons why the Civil War was fought, was because the North was larger beneficiaries of that technology at the time versus what was happening in the South. And of course, money again was a main motivator in that war. But here again, like Hickok and a lot of these guys, they came from that era of brother fighting brother, and a lot of blood was spilled in on this land in this country during that time frame. So think about the energy of what was going on at that time. I mean, you all go to the stands, right? You go to baseball games or football games or basketball games, you can feel that electricity. People talk about it all the time. Well, what do you think's happening every single second of every single day? Just because you're not tapped into that electricity doesn't mean that it's not there. It's there. And sometimes when you move through these ages or eons and events happen, that it's amplified. And so all of that was happening at that time too, and just coming out of the Civil War and those things. So which would make one go, I'm surprised it wasn't even worse than it was, considering all of what was going on. So again, I actually did want to make a different video because this actually morphs into something that's currently happening in Minnesota right now, regarding our indoctrination centers, and I don't want to get into it right now, but I'll probably do a video here after the school board meeting this Monday, and hopefully enlighten some people about what's going on locally here and across the state. But my argument is to reiterate is this: you people that think this way, that think that voluntarism, that local hierarchies, where you all as the single largest minority group across the planet, not just in the United States, across the planet, that being the individual, the sovereign individual, you are the largest minority. To think that a system whereby you have local hierarchies that meet the needs for everyone versus, hey, I know you're a big name around here, I'll go ahead and scratch your back, give me a little kickback. Don't think that shit's just happening in Washington, D.C. It's happening in every municipality to some extent. It just gets larger. The playground gets a little bit bigger the higher up you go on that control authoritarian ladder. And so, and what I'm saying is absolutely truth, because you all are fighting about red and blue. Donkeys, asses, and elephants. I mean, if your system was so great, why are you arguing? Why do we have so many problems? If your system is so wonderful, why is any of this stuff going on? The biggest problem I think humanity is facing, and I'm definitely going to touch on this later, the biggest problem humanity is facing is their absence for objective truth. And they don't want to hear it. And they don't want to know, the problems that exist somewhere else. And they don't want to internalize that the fact that they might be wrong, and that there might be a better way, and that there might be just ignorant in understanding the mechanisms that have propelled us to this point in history. And so, do I want it to be like the Wild West? Well, I would like there to be as much freedom as there was back then versus now, for sure. One other thing I was going to mention about that too, speaking about law enforcement and everything that's going on, is that you have some of these guys like Hickok, a complete thug, Butch Cassidy, who claimed he never even shot anybody. I think that was him. But a lot of these people, robbers and murderers and just violent people, they became the lawmen. And why? Because local towns and municipalities decided and not with 100% agreement by everybody in those towns, mind you. It's just that they were the city councils, and so they got to decide the dictates. Evidently, with some magical pen and some magical piece of paper, they got to write down certain ordinances within their bylaws, if you will, and got to say that things like, well, you can't carry a gun in town past 8 o'clock, or you can't carry a gun in town ever, uh, which led to a lot of other problems as well. But the thing of it is those council members and those town leaders, they didn't want blood on their hands, and they didn't want to do the dirty work. And so what they did was they hired a lot of these thugs, these killers, to come in and act as law enforcement. And by the way, incidentally, the first, I believe, well, the first idea of police officers were invoked to stop the slaves from running away off of plantations and whatnot. But the true formation of police departments happened as a result of, I believe it was in Boston, because the ports, believe it or not, they were fighting illegal immigration back then. Not to mention they had a lot of robberies and theft on the docks and the ports. And so the port owners decided that they could come up with a grand plan to get everybody to realize that, hey, it would be in everybody's best interest if everybody paid certain men to go ahead and do what should have been done privately and privatized by those businesses still. Go ahead and become the local law enforcement in that region. Keep in mind too that for the majority of the time, law enforcement doesn't necessarily prevent acts of violence from happening. They oftentimes show up, 8 out of 10 times show up after those events happen. And of the times that domestic violence occurs and the police arrive prior to any real aggravated assault or battery or what happens or what have you, I would think the majority of those times, if we lived in a society that actually propelled human nature to expand their consciousness and grow psychologically into more mature adults, I think that of the other 2 out of 10 times the police were called, I think the majority of those times that people would actually take care of the problem themselves. Not to mention the fact that those rates of incidents, as long as we grow psychologically and in consciousness, those rates of incidents of domestic abuse and assault and whatever else it might be would be on the decline. Not to mention, and I'm going to say this in every damn video, if as long as you get away from the debt slave system that you have going on via control of your monetary policy that is absolutely making everyone slaves and getting everyone to fight, get rid of that would do a lot of good too in order for people to grow up. And so to end this whole thing, do I want it to be like the Wild West? Freedom wise, yes. Control wise and about money, no. It's where we're going wrong, and we, for some odd reason, just can't seem to figure it out. And yeah, I guess on that note, I'll end it. I hope you enjoy it. Like I said, I'll hopefully have time to do more, and would love to hear more feedback and whatnot. But we got some things we need to conquer and grow through coming up for sure in our culture and in our society. And I just hope that we continue to really try to understand one another and to look for the truth in the matter. Instead of hacking away at the branches of evil, we start actually attacking the root of the problems and go from there. But I wish you all a blessed night.